Welcome to Online History of Sexuality. This week is a shorter week due to the Easter Monday. So you have just chapter 10 in the Major Problems text, and then there is a link to George Chauncey's article on Moodle. So this week you're going to be reading about the invention of homosexuality and heterosexuality. And so it makes some sense to talk a little bit about who the theorists are who are creating these kinds of labels. And so they're known collectively by historians as the sexologists. And so the textbook will point out that the first time that we see the term homosexuality used is in 1869, and it's used by the man that you see pictured for you on the PowerPoint. This was a lawyer in Germany who coined the term homosexuality as part of his efforts trying to decriminalize same-sex love in German law. In the essay called The Invention of Heterosexuality, Jonathan Katz will mention Kurt Benny and will note that he used the term homosexuality publicly in 1869 to appeal for sodomy law reform. Prior to 1869, then there was really no discourse on homosexuality, although certain acts are banned, including the act of sodomy, something that gets associated with later with homosexual behavior. So there are sometimes references to sodomites, and this is a label for somebody who receives rather than gives in a sexual act. But generally speaking, the law really doesn't distinguish identities from illegal activities. And so the law punishes the act rather than, say, the person. So in the 1860s in Germany, there is a movement to get rid of laws regarding sodomy, and writings begin to emerge on homosexuality. In 1862 already, one author, Karl Ulrichs, begins writing and publishing 12 books with the collective title Researches on the Riddle of Love Between Men. Ulrich is somebody who believed that homosexuals constituted what he called a third sex. And in his theory, the body is male or female, but the mind trapped in the body is that of the other gender. So sexologists emerge at the end of the 19th century in great numbers, and then also by the early 20th century. The sexologists consider themselves to be scientists. They do research, they conduct experiments, and many had medical degrees. The popular view of homosexuality in the late 19th century was that homosexuals are still people who are far beyond the pale of what many considered normal, and those are air quotes for you, sexual behavior. And part of the reason that historians sort of think that this is the case is that they point out that many of the sexologists who are doing the research did their research in mental institutions, and many sexologists therefore were very negative, particularly toward homosexuality. So we have a phenomenon by which sexologists are writing both against popular views but also reflecting certain popular views. And so in the work of many sexologists, homosexuals in particular were considered vice-ridden, completely jaded by sex, or they were extreme masturbators and practiced what many had called the solitary vice. Sexologists see homosexuals as inheriting or acquiring a medical condition like syphilis. And some people thought that homosexuals had become homosexual as an offshoot of mental illness. And so one of the prominent views of homosexuals among even sexologists at the end of the 19th century was that homosexuals were psychopaths, evolutionary degenerates, and represented a reversal in the evolutionary chain. Sexologists are the ones who invent the term invert, and this is similar to what Ulrichs was saying in 1862. The term invert implied that the subject had taken over the characteristics of the opposite sex. And so there was a lot of diversity among the views of sexologists, but a lot of the views of sexologists were very negative towards homosexuality. We get a little taste of the view of the so-called third sex in an earlier chapter in our textbook, in the way that people were making sense of the case involving Alice Mitchell, who unfortunately killed her lover, Frida Ward. And we could see there that they very much talked about Alice Mitchell as an invert and somebody who clearly had mental illness, and those things were all related. Another sexologist, however, representing kind of a break from maybe some of the popular views of sexologists, was Havelock Ellis. He publishes a book in 1896 called The Sexual Inversion. So he's still using that idea in order to understand what's happening for people who have sexual attraction toward members of the same sex. But he was not as negative as the rest of the sexologists. He does his writing actually to decriminalize homosexuality. And so one of his main questions is to come up with an answer to the question of, is homosexuality a biological or a cultural phenomenon? So is homosexuality something that one inherits, or is homosexuality an identity that someone acquires? Ellis's own answer to that question was that sexual inversion was a congenital condition, meaning that it was inborn. And that's actually part of the reason then that he argues against laws that had criminalized homosexual acts. If somebody is born with the same-sex attraction, how can you criminalize the behavior if somebody is born with this condition? So he argued that the laws criminalizing homosexual behavior were archaic and unjust. Jonathan Katz will mention a few other sexologists in his article, and this is the first article of 2 in the chapter in Major Problems. He will mention Dr. James Kiernan of Chicago, who in 1892 includes one of the earliest known uses of the word homosexual in American English. He will also note, however, that Kiernan will talk about the word heterosexual for one of the first times, and that for Kiernan, heterosexual wasn't a term that he applied to normal people either. Instead, Kiernan will talk about heterosexuals as people who engaged in, again, here's the quote, abnormal methods of gratification or techniques that divorced pleasure from procreation. So for Kiernan, if you were engaging in sexual acts, even male to female, female to male, if those acts were not something that could lead to the birth of a child, those acts were also considered to be abnormal, and he actually thought that was the way to use the term heterosexual. The other individual that is prominent in the first article by Jonathan Katz is Krafft-Ebing. Krafft-Ebing is significant for Katz in particular because he is somebody among the sexologists who conceives of sexual identities as either erotic feeling for a different sex, in the case of heterosexuals, or erotic feelings for the same sex, in the case of homosexuals. So even though he continues to believe that there is an inborn sexual instinct for relations with the opposite sex, the inherent purpose of which is to foster procreation, he's actually someone who begins to tease apart sexual desire from procreation in terms of how he conceives of sexual identities. So the article by Katz is really important because his survey of the sexologists leads him to conclude that as much as homosexuality was something that had to be created and was created at the end of the 19th century, so too was heterosexuality, because even the way it is first used, it is not a term that was used to designate so-called normal people. So as much as homosexuality is invented, says Katz, so too is the heterosexual identity. One can't really talk about one could, but one isn't going to. One can't talk about the sexologist without talking about Dr. Sigmund Freud. Dr. Sigmund Freud in 1905 published 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and he's very interesting because he will argue in those essays that all human beings are bisexual, born with the prevailing tendency toward what he called polymorphous perversion, meaning everyone kind of desires everyone. And so he is somebody who is going to come up with a much more fluid idea about sexuality. Freud will visit the United States in 1910, and after he makes that tour of the United States in 1910, his works are widely translated, making him more popular here in the United States than in Europe. And so his ideas about sexuality are also incredibly important, and it's these ideas where he begins to articulate the importance of the object of one's desire in terms of sexual identity that Carol Smith Rosenberg will argue against a little bit in terms of this isn't really applicable to the 19th century in the way that we look at women's friendships, men's friendships, even if those friendships take on very romantic characteristics. So those are your sexologists very, very quickly. And my favorite week of the semester, quite honestly, is when we talk about the Chauncey article, Sexual Perversion or Christian Brotherhood, because that article is really looking at the extent to which these ideas that are being articulated about sexual identity, to what extent these are making their way down to the way maybe normal human beings, that is, people not in the academy, how are they making sense of who they are and whether they're heterosexuals, homosexuals, etc., etc. So the image here is of the Army and Navy YMCA in Newport, Rhode Island, and this is the setting for Chauncey's article. The article is going to tell you a little bit about an official Navy investigation of homosexuality in Newport, Rhode Island. You're going to read about young men who worked as decoys in the investigation, and their job was to entrap homosexuals. They would then gather this information and testify before a naval court, as well as at several civilian trials. And so George Chauncey is going to use that testimony and the reports of these decoys, as well as the reaction by the men who are accused of engaging in homosexual behavior, to really kind of problematize the extent to which these ideas about sexual identity are really making their way down into the masses. And so he will note, for example, and I think this is super interesting, that certainly among the folks in the Navy, there's still very much this idea that one can engage in the activities of homosexuality without being a homosexual if one retains one's sort of masculine identity. And so that's kind of interesting, right? But at the same time, there will be definitely people that are identified as fitting more into the category of maybe someone with a homosexual identity, and they're going to be referred to pejoratively as fairies, and so on and so forth. And these were people who were on the receiving end, shall we say, of sexual acts between men, and then also took up a more effeminate persona. But what's also going to be interesting, I hope that you'll see in the article, is there's also a very interesting class dimension that goes into the way people understand sexuality and sexual identity, because some of these decoys are going to make accusations against ministers. And the ministers will say, no, we're not homosexuals. We are engaging in genteel friendships with men. And in some ways, their language will kind of harken back to the kind of things that we saw in the Rotundo article, in terms of the sort of not necessarily romantic friendship, but the caring nature of a relationship between men. And they will say, even though maybe in working class culture, that more caring nature makes me seem effeminate and therefore a fairy, therefore a homosexual. That's not at all what's going on. So look for that. You're going to also read a snippet from George Chauncey in the Major Problems book, in which he'll talk about some gay subcultures. Okay, the other thing that your textbook will talk a little bit about, especially the major problems, and it will do so largely through the first article, kind of in passing, but then also through some of the primary sources, is kind of what's going on in terms of sexuality in the 1920s. I took my history of women in the United States from Lois Banner, and she was the one who first pointed out that there was this kind of revolt against Comstockian prudery that occurred in the 1920s, with an article that came out that actually proclaimed that because of all of the attention given to sexuality, that it was in fact sex o'clock in America. So that's fun. She was also someone who pointed out that because of his speaking tour, Sigmund Freud's theories that sex dominated life and that social ills were the result of individual neuroses caused by child rearing became very popular in the 1920s. The 1920s is also the decade in which jazz became very popular in the United States. And so jazz was something that brought about some new dances that we maybe saw in an earlier chapter, the two-step, the tango, which brought human bodies very close to one another. But the lyrics of certain jazz music was also very sexual. So one example comes from Bessie Smith in the song You've Gotta Give Me Some, 1929. And if that's not self-explanatory, here's just a little bit from the song. Loving is the thing I crave. For your love, I'll be your slave. You gotta give me some. Yes, give me some. Can't you hear me pleading? You gotta give me some. So the sexuality that seemed to be embedded in the music of jazz, whether in the lyrics, the dancing, that also made it seem like it was in fact sex o'clock in America. We also see the emergence in the 1920s of the flapper. And so I have a couple of examples of the flapper pictured there for you. Women were bobbing their hair. That was very upsetting to a lot of people. Actually, F. Scott Fitzgerald has a short story called Bernice Bobs Her Hair. Fascinating. They stopped wearing corsets. They shortened their skirts. They took up smoking and drinking. And of course, they are drinking at these illegal speakeasies of the 1920s because, of course, Prohibition was in effect from 1918 to 1933. I always point out that the flapper was a term used to characterize a minority of women in the 1920s who broke from traditional fashion and gender conventions. But I even have pictures of my grandmother, who was in her 20s in the 1920s, having the bobbed hair and the shorter skirts. So flappers did work hard to look different from Victorian women, so it's definitely a rejection of Victorian values in the way that they are dressing and looking. The long curls were in fact replaced by the short bobs. Women are rejecting the petticoats, and they tried to achieve a more boyish shape by going so far as to binding their breasts and dieting to reduce their hip size. And fun fact for you, the bathroom scale appears in the 1920s to make sure that women are on track for that kind of thing. Flappers are also women who wore makeup, and this was seen as pretty transgressive because makeup was definitely something in the 19th century that only prostitutes or loose women wore. So that's pretty crazy. Flappers also tended to engage in some forms of sexual experimentation, and often it was the case that it was in the form of petting. Petting was such a big deal that you actually have a primary source in Major Problems where women are discussing the phenomenon of petting in 1930. So petting is definitely then, some woman describes it as, another man pawing at her. So some forms of fondling, but it's not vaginal sex. But it's still expected then that women would be virgins until they married. But petting is also something that's popularized by the growing popularity of the automobile. I mentioned already the dancing that flappers would engage in, and there's also a great deal of flirting that is characteristic of flapper culture. Now, I couldn't resist putting in this next slide, even though I know narrated PowerPoints are super tedious, but the image of the flapper becomes kind of a cultural icon of the 1920s, in part because of Hollywood and the frequent appearance of the flapper in movies, and then, of course, in a certain degree, in advertisements as well. And so the image I'm showing you right now is of an actress named Mary Pickford, who was the queen of the silent screen, and was the first woman in the movie business to make $1 million. Mary Pickford was known as, I think, America's sweetheart for a period of time, and so she had these long curls that were very characteristic of sort of the Victorian woman and even the early 20th century woman. But she eventually just couldn't get roles anymore. And so she too ended up chopping her famous curls in order to adapt that flapper image. The most beloved Hollywood flapper of the 1920s, however, was Clara Bow, and she is pictured for you there. She is known as the It Girl because of her leading role in a movie called It. And although it was never clearly defined, it tends to be associated with sex appeal. One man described Clara Bow's effect on him as something akin to taking a shot of dope. Bow had a boyish figure, which was the great demand of the 1920s. She was described as having flirty eyes, and she was also someone who had red hair, which in the 1920s was associated with, quote, highly sexed women. Despite her film successes in the 1920s, she was somewhat emotionally unstable, according to some biographies, and she was certainly hurt by scandals that she engaged regarding affairs she had potentially engaged in with leading men. When talkies began to get big by the early 1930s, Bow, who had a heavy Brooklyn accent, found the transition somewhat difficult. And in 1931, Bow actually announced that she was leaving Hollywood to concentrate on her husband and 2 sons. Hollywood was also a great source for some of the new conventions about marriage. And so this is one of the things that Katz touches on, like because of the new consumer culture, there's kind of this new emphasis about even within marriage, sex is meant to be pleasurable for both parties. And so Cecil B. DeMille, who's one of the famous Hollywood directors of the 1920s, makes a lot of movies about sort of new ideas regarding heterosexuality within marriage. And so this movie here, Why Change Your Wife in 1920, follows a couple where the man ends up leaving his wife because she's become too much of a fuddy-dud, takes up with a much younger woman who is more of this flapper type, realizes that the younger woman is only after him for his money, and in the meantime, his wife, who is played by Gloria Swanson, one of the greats, again, of the silent era, she has transformed herself into kind of this sexy flapper type. And so they end up coming back together. And so it's like, even sex within marriage needs to be sexy, flirty, and fun. And this was definitely a new idea in the 1920s. And part of the reason why Margaret Sanger's crusade for birth control is certainly catching on, because there is this growing acceptance of sex can be something that happens strictly for pleasure and not for procreation. Okay, that's it for now. Stay tuned though, because next week we've got some more reading. And I hope that you guys are all doing well. Bye.